It's time for us to begin. Jim and I were just consulting about books. Do we have anybody in the class who does not have one of the books on David and the exploits of David? We have several left over. I was just kind of calculating how many we need to buy for the next study, so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but appreciate your participation with us. Glad to see everybody this morning. We're still needing to increase our numbers a bit. If you have a friend, encourage them to come and be in a Bible class with us. Nice to see Trish with us this morning. We're always glad to have her. Let's begin with a prayer. Father, you continue to bless us in a variety of ways. We pray that you'll help us to be more mindful every day of how blessed we are. You have cared for us materially. You care for us spiritually. You teach us how to love one another. And we're grateful now for the series that Scott Sager's engaged in reminding us of those one another passages in the Bible where you're telling us we do not live in the world alone. We live with others, and we need to learn how to live with others. We're grateful for this continued focus on the study of David, and we ask you to bless us in our class today. In Christ's name, amen. It occurred to me this week that I thought that I needed to look up and see what I could find out. I've about decided that other than probably Moses and Abraham and certainly Jesus, there's probably more space devoted in the Bible to the study of David than any other single character. He appears in 1st and 2nd Samuel, he appears in 1st and 2nd Kings, and he appears in 1st Chronicles. And then there's all of Psalms. We have all of this space devoted either to David's exploits or to David's words. And as I pointed out in the beginning of this study, it's always fascinating to me that David, as we're studying him, is the only person in the Bible named David. It's as if God wanted to say, now I want you to pay real close attention to this one. He might have said, he's mine, and I want you to listen to him, learn from him. And so we continue looking at those exploits of David. And today, while our lesson is entitled David and Michal, I thought later we probably should have titled it David and the Ark, because frankly, the Ark is the catalyst for everything that happens in this particular section that we've chosen. But still, we need to know some stuff about Michal, and we're going to look at that as we begin our study today. I started out writing in my notes, David and Michal's storied marriage is filled with all kinds of ups and downs. They move from highs of profound love to a low of disrespect and loss of love, I guess we could say. It is true with many biblical marriages because of the way they're conducted. You and I are still a little horrified at the concept of marriages that are arranged by somebody else. We have them in the Bible, and sometimes those arranged marriages don't work out very well, as we remember from the story of Jacob, who thought he was getting Rachel and he got Leah. Imagine in the middle of a marriage ceremony, the groom gets to lift that veil, and lo and behold, it's not who he was looking for. It's her sister. Now, that would not be particularly satisfying. We have the same problem with Michal. David was first given her older sister Merab, and then finally Michal takes over later. So let me just review some things with you. This marriage is built on competition. How would you like to live in a house where there were 6 other wives? David had 7 wives. That's a lot of competition. I remember doing a lesson one time on Rachel and Leah in the house of Jacob, and I called it One Woman Too Many. But imagine 7 of them. Interestingly enough, of those 7 wives, Michal is the only one who never bore a child. We'll find out why at the end of the lesson for today. So there's a lot of competition. And certainly as they began to have children, the competition became more intense. Who could have more children? who was looking for some way to rise in that position of royalty where David was king. Our first experience with the daughter of Saul, as she's just mentioned, not by name, is in the story of Goliath. One of Saul's promises is that the man who will kill Goliath, you remember he makes 3 promises. He can have my daughter for a wife, he'll be a person of real position, and he won't have to pay taxes. Now, I'm not sure which was the greater appeal, a wife or not paying taxes, but both of them sounded pretty good. So here's the first time we have any reference to Saul's daughter. And as we continue with the story, we kind of think, well, he's talking about Michal. He really is not. He's talking about Merab. But somewhere in the process of those negotiations, Saul changed his mind, and he gave Merab to somebody else. So Michal is left. It's not surprising that Saul would do something kind of off the wall. He just was unpredictable, and he certainly was in this case. And so finally, Saul discovers that Michal loves David. It's interesting if you look closely at 1 Samuel chapter 18. We're not studying that, but I just point this out. In chapter 18, we're told 4 times in that chapter of people who loved David. He was just that kind of person. Verse 1 says Jonathan loved David. Well, we've already established that fact in our study. We're told in verse 16 that Israel and Judah loved David. Not only a person loved him, but the nation loved him. We're told in verse 25 that Saul's servants loved David. Saul didn't, but his household did, because the last verse says Michal loved David. 4 times in that chapter, we're told of individuals or groups of individuals who were devoted to David. And no wonder the people were singing this great song, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. No wonder Saul was jealous. No wonder he hated David as all of that kind of stuff increased. Well, I want us to look at where we go from here. You remember that when finally the negotiations were underway for David to marry one of Saul's daughters, Saul set a very high dowry. He insisted that David bring him 100 foreskins of Philistines. Now, it's quite likely that Saul just assumed that if David attacked that many Philistines, some of them would get him, and David would be out of the picture, get rid of him. David apparently was interested in Michal because he and his men brought in 200 rather than the required 100, and David was unscathed. Nobody killed him. Nobody injured him. So he paid off the dowry. A little bit later, after Michal and David are married, Saul has another one of his attempted attacks on David, and you'll remember that Michal helped him escape, letting him down over the wall, and lied to her father about him, indicating she was still loving David, and David must have been pleased with her. But then somewhere after all of that, Saul gave Michal to a man named Paltiel. He's also called Palti, another location. But he gave her to somebody else. And so here's David, who has lost his wife. Saul just could not be depended on. He was always looking for somewhere else to go, something else to do. One of the saddest pictures, I think, in the Bible deals with this story of Michal and her first husband. Chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. Let me just read 3 verses. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of the Philistines." And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish. Ishbosheth named himself king. He was Saul's son. And he stole Michal away. She was his sister. and gave her to somebody else, to Paltiel. And then the story says, then her husband went along with her to Bahurim, weeping behind her. So Abner said to him, go return. And he returned. What a picture. Here is Michal and her new husband. And as we can see the chronology in the Bible, some time had passed. They'd been together for a while. And then when David said, I want Michal back, they returned her. But the second husband follows along, weeping behind her. He's lost his wife. And Abner, in his typical forceful way, said, just go back home. And so the man did. Well, let's look at the actual text for today. We're looking at 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we have 3 readings from there. And we start out with a section that's called Moving the Ark. Again, just a little background. You remember the Ark of the Covenant was established by Moses when it contained the tablets of stone, that pot of manna, Aaron's rod that budded. Those were a part of it, and it went everywhere the Jews did. At some point in a battle with the Philistines, the Israelites foolishly took the ark out on the battlefield as if it was some sort of magical charm. It would help them win the battle. Well, it didn't. They lost the battle, and the Philistines stole the ark, took it away as spoils of battle. And they prided themselves. They had stolen Israel's favorite thing. But as time passed, the Philistines began to suffer. They suffered illnesses, they suffered defeats, and finally all they could think of was, we need to blame this on that ark. We shouldn't have gotten it. And so they sent it back to Israel. And for a while it is stored at a house. As David made his plans to become king, he was also planning that he wanted to make Jerusalem his capital. And he built a tabernacle, a tent, much like that Moses had had for the ark. And once he got that built, he was going to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, bringing it home where it belonged. Well, that's where we are in our text for today. Verses 5 to 8 of 2 Samuel 6. And then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on saterns, and on cymbals. And when all came to Nahor's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error. And he died there by the ark of God. And David became very angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. There's a lot of background to all of this, as you remember. The law of Moses had decreed that there was only a certain way by which the ark could be moved. It was not to be handled. It was to be moved by poles that were carried on men's shoulders. But this time they decided to put it on a cart. Aren't we always looking away for a more convenient way to do something? If God had thought of this, he would have said, do it. Obviously, God wasn't thinking ahead when he had them carry it on their shoulders. So they put it on a cart. And 2 men are walking along beside. They are thinking about making sure it doesn't fall. And then an oxen stumbles, and there must have been a little teetering because Uzzah put out his hand just to steady it. But God said, don't touch it. And Uzzah did. And God struck him dead. There's no question of how he died, why he died. God struck him dead. And David reacts very negatively. He's angry at God. After all, Uzzah was trying to do God a favor. He was going to protect the ark. And we rationalize that kind of thing. And surely God would want me to do this because I'm thinking of him. But God was expecting us to think of what he had required. When they prepared to move the ark a second time, there are some changes made. Suddenly there is a realization that we didn't do something right the first time. David did not continue to bring the ark into Jerusalem. He left it where it was. And then finally, when he decided he would make a move, it was time for a real national celebration, describing very much what we heard on the first time. There was a lot of music, dancing surrounding the move, and then the plan is to continue. The fault of Uzzah's death was not with David. The fault was not with Uzzah. The fault, rather, was the people did not pay attention to God's rules. They did not go back to look at what the law had specified. My wife says they didn't learn to follow the instructions, the directions. The whole passage there, I think, shows, number one, God means what he says. When God says do this, we do that. When God says don't do that, we don't do that. And there is no expiration date on any of those. They continue as long as God's will is in force. It simply says God means what he says and that obedience is always necessary. Okay, a few verses later, we make that second effort, starting at verse 12, on the way to Jerusalem. And now was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belonged to him because of the ark of God. Just as the Philistines suffered for having the ark present, now the house of Obed-Edom, where the ark has been stored, are benefiting from its presence. God is blessing them. So David went and brought up the ark from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. Not with sadness, but with gladness. And so it was that when those bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house brought the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. Now as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and twirling before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. This is a great account, but there's a much greater detail given in 1 Chronicles. I want to go back and say something about that. You remember as children, some of us learned a little song that named all the books of the Old Testament. We learned to sing them. Maybe I did. I won't sing it. But I just remember when we got to Chronicles, we said 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which gives us the record. Interesting enough, what the Chronicles are all about. Those 2 books are devoted exclusively to the nation of Judah. They repeat many of the things we read in Samuel and Kings, all devoted to Judah. 1st Chronicles focuses exclusively on David. 2nd Chronicles focuses exclusively on Solomon. And so when you go to the Chronicles, you're just going to get, in most cases, an expanded version of what we read in the earlier passages in Samuel and in Kings. Well, that's the case here. In 1 Chronicles chapter 15, there's a more detailed account of what we've just read. And that's when they say, you know, the first time we didn't do this the way God told us to. Somebody went back and read the account, and they decided we need to do it the way it's spelled out, not the way we thought was convenient. And so that's exactly what we're told in the Chronicles account. They said the trouble the first time was, quote, because we did not consult God about the proper order. One statement that I think was particularly worth noting from it, quote, the Levites bore the ark of God on their shoulders by its poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. Isn't it amazing how well things turn out when you do it the way God said? That's what they found. So this time, the ark makes its journey safely, gets to Jerusalem, but there's something else going on at the same time. David is so happy. He is so filled with gladness, as we read, that he has to show off that great emotion of his. I don't think anybody questions in the reading the stories of David that he was an emotional man. He's emotional in his language. We prize that in the Psalms. Great emotion expressed in those Psalms. There's emotion in his life, in his activities. He didn't do anything half-hearted. He was all out. Think of the young David hearing Goliath. Let's take him on. No reluctance, no shyness, no doubt. The emotions there were strong, as they are over and over and over again. Well, he's emotional here. And after all, he is king. He's able to accomplish this. He's the one who arranged to use Jerusalem as his capital. He's the one that arranged for a tabernacle to be constructed. And now he's bringing the ark home, and he's bringing it home safely. No more uzzas. No more Uzzah mistakes. No more hindrances. And so he is dancing and whirling. And he's undressed down to a linen ephod, which is the priestly garment. He's now acting like a priest, welcoming the ark into Jerusalem. The people obviously were impressed with all of this, but there was one person who was very unimpressed. Michal looks out her window and sees her husband acting like a part of the mob. He was acting like a commoner. And she couldn't take that. After all, she'd been a princess pretty much all her life. Now she's married to a king. She expects better behavior and better conduct. We've all just gone through the death and burial of Queen Elizabeth, and we watched all the pomp and pageantry that are associated with royalty. I think Michal would have loved that. David was anything but exercising pomp and pageantry. He was letting the natural self live, and that bothered her. Well, let's go to our third text, where Michal rebukes David. Verses 20 to 23. Then David returned to bless his household. Please notice that he goes home to express his gratitude and appreciation for his family, to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, she's still the daughter of Saul. She's not the wife of David. She's still connected with her father. Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, and this is the most sarcastic statement, "How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." No gratitude for what he's accomplished. No pride in the fact that now the nation is even grander. No. He just acts like one of those base fellows, part of the crowd. How fortunate we were to have such a man. No, she was not impressed at all. What do you think made this happen to Michal? What happened that canceled out that love expressed much earlier for him? I think two or three things. I think number one, the way the marriage occurred. She was second fiddle. She was not the first choice. Then she had to compete in David's household with 6 other women calling themselves David's wives. Then she was taken off and married to somebody else, and maybe for that period of time, there was a kind of peacefulness that she didn't have to worry about all the pomp and pageantry. And then she was taken away from Palti. And he must have loved her. He followed along weeping for her. And then she was returned to David. And apparently her love had cooled somewhat over the years. And now he behaves in a manner she thinks is very unkingly. Why didn't he act like who he was? I think this is the natural David. And she is offended by all of that. She accuses him of nakedness, which, by the way, was very offensive to the Jews. Remember the story of Noah who gets drunk, and two of his sons walk backwards to cover him so that they do not see their father's nakedness. That was offensive to the Jewish people. So she's offended by what she thinks David has done. It cancels out David's intention to come and bless his household. He wants things to go well for them. And so he's met with this sarcastic response. So, one nasty crack deserves another, I suppose. So David responds to Michal. It was before the Lord that he was dancing, who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this. And I will be humble in my own sight, but as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor. Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Notice David's response. It was God who chose me over Saul. It was God who made me king. What I do to honor God. Notice that in transporting the ark, he stopped every 6 paces for a sacrifice. He made sure God was honored and recognized in all of this. Michal is thinking earthly, David is thinking heavenly. He says to her, you think what I did today was bad? I'm going to be more undignified than this. That doesn't mean that he's going to try to do anything that's disreputable, but he's going to offend her in more ways than one because of her high standards. He's going to be purely God's man. He acts like one who's after God's own heart. And that final statement is rather shocking. Michal had no children to the day of her death. Some have suggested that was God's cursing her for what she had done, much as Uzzah was cursed for violating God's law. I would rather think it was the fact that David no longer cared for her as a wife. She had no opportunity to conceive. She was shut out of David's life because of the way she had treated him. So the rest of her life, she was barren. Again, the only one of David's wives who had no children. I think it denotes that David could no longer accept her as his wife. He gave no opportunity for her to have children. Michal is a sad case in the Bible. She is a woman picked second choice to marry the king. She's a woman taken away from the king and given to somebody else, then forcefully returned, and then she's offended by the way he acts. She's just left out all the way around, and I think is deserving of some pity on our part. Some things I would suggest from this lesson today. Details about sacred matters are important to God. Uzzah learned that fact the hard way. Think how often in God's commands there are very rigid details given, particularly in the law of Moses. Those were to be respected to the letter. Uzzah did not. 2, good intentions are never enough when we seek to obey God. I meant it for this, but God saw it another way. Good intentions do not contradict or counteract God's law. Uzzah's intentions were noble. We all feel for him. You have to. He meant nothing but good. Well, Joseph says to his brothers, you meant it for bad, but God turned it good. In this case, Uzzah meant it for good, but God said that's not right. we need to think about our intentions when we try to use them to outweigh our obedience. Number 3, marriages are often affected by angry words. And that's what Michal uses. Her words are angry, they are offensive, they are sarcastic. Paul reminds us, be ye angry and sin not. Words matter. Number 4, position can make for dangerous expectations for self and for others. Michal seemed to take a great deal of pride in her position, first as a princess, then as a queen. And she had some unreasonable expectations for herself, but she also had some unreasonable expectations for David. And that presents our story for us. Well, we'll continue next week with another exploit of David's. Jim will be taking the class, and we're moving along, and we're coming close to the end of this one. We get started on a book, and the next thing we know, it's winding up, and we're moving to another one. I'll go ahead and mention this morning, Jim and I've talked about it. We're going to use next quarter, the quarterly covers the one-chapter books of the Bible. There are 5 little books in the Bible that are only 1 chapter long. And so we're going to take lessons from Obadiah and Philemon and 2nd and 3rd John and Jude. See what we can learn from those brief letters. We'll have new quarterlies for you shortly. Thank you very much.